Hey everyone, and welcome back to Crotus Pren. Today we're going to be discussing the idea of the Legion not existing. You may be thinking, well, that makes no sense because they're right there in game. How could they not exist? Well, to understand this, let's begin at the beginning, with Frank Morrison, a broken and traumatized teenager who has just arrived in the town of Ormond. He's 19 and has nothing to show for it, and he's there because of his adoptive father, who isn't the first, but instead one in the line of many. Frank doesn't attend school when he meets a girl named Julie at a party, who introduces Frank to her friends Susie and Joey. They're all friends, but Frank and Julie have a unique connection. It's stated that their time together was the perfect break from the boring conformity of their small, insignificant everyday lives. Frank saw it as an opportunity to shape their lack of experience into something powerful. He lined up nights of debauchery and rampage, testing their limits. Bullying, vandalism, and theft were essentially their weekend plans. It came to a point where they would do anything he asked. Nothing was off limits when they put their masks on. They established themselves as a group, situated at the abandoned Mount Ormond ski resort, even recruiting an artist from their school, Jeff Johansson, to paint them a Legion mural on the resort's walls. Finally, they commit a murder at Joey's old workplace, hiding the body and getting taken by the entity, leaving the whole town of Ormond confused. So what I want to focus on is Frank and Julie and their arguably broken minds and twisted worldviews. To do this, we can look into the tome lore for the Legion named Soldiers of Mayhem. This tome lore occurs before the base lore. Frank and Julie, to say the least, have a strange connection as two isolated teens. Julie amazes Frank with her profound knowledge of serial killers, as she leads him to her bedroom and shows him her scrapbooks filled with pictures and clippings of famous murders. This is followed by Julie writing the words Soldiers of Mayhem onto Frank's shirt after telling a story about causing chaos in Ormond. Frank likes the idea, but says he hates the name. Frank and Julie like to watch people unravel. This is how Frank views others, or normal people. Ugly people, he calls them. It's the name he gave to those people who need to be right, who always need to be right. And they were the easiest to push over the edge. Ormond was full of them, ugly people, entitled preps and politicians who would turn blue in the face if you challenged any of their beliefs. Next, whilst hanging out in the ski resort, let's all just imagine buckets of money. Frank shakes his head. Money is dead on its own. Money doesn't inspire the world. Real passion and emotion does. See yourself doing what it is you want to do for the rest of your life. Be clear and focused and do not waver and watch the world work in your favor. Another silence. Julie smirks. Frank nods seriously. She closes her eyes and imagines herself and her friends turning Ormond into their personal playpen. She opens her eyes. After this, they go on to steal car emblems, rob a store, and then burn down a theater. Julie then has a dream of killing someone with her friends, just before being called to the theater by Frank. They then finally approach the store for what is their first murder. Now, there are interesting connections we can draw between Joey and Frank. Julie mentions Joey can't seem to keep a job. With a laugh, Frank says, Joey sounds normal. You know how much programming it takes to get a human being to accept the whole 8-hour-a-day routine. Much like Joey can't keep a job, Frank can't keep a family. Joey does, however, work, where it appears Frank does not. Joey is kinda like Frank if he hadn't been brought up in a constant rotating door of foster parents. Interestingly too, the tome lore goes out of its way to have Julie refer to Frank as Frankie, a similar sound to Joey. Julie and Susie share the same connection of being two sides of the same coin. They also have this same name structure of Julie and Susie. Susie is academic and considers applying to college, but as she's shy and impressionable, she bunks off school and joins the Legion. Julie is firm in her beliefs, even more so than Frank, and thinks very little of education. Despite this, they do both seem to attend school still. Both Susie and Joey do not embrace the idea of money being meaningless, and the worldview that everyone around them is sheep, entitled due to the disregard of Frank and Julie. Susie is still academic and wants to go to college, and Joey works despite always getting fired. So Susie and Joey are similar to Frank and Julie, but fundamentally they are different. Susie and Joey are with them, but not like them. There are some interesting things to note on. For example, the lack of background on 2 out of the 4 Legion members, these two being Susie and Joey. Susie and Joey are two people who are apparently friends of Julie's after Frank arrives in Ormond. However, these two aren't expanded on much aside Susie being the shy one and Joey being the slightly reckless one. Joey and Susie are also only ever referred to by their first names. and that's because they don't actually have a last name. This is highly irregular for a killer. In fact, every Dead by Daylight killer has a last name, aside the huntress Anna, as well as Adiris the Plague. She was raised in the Red Forest, away from civilization, where a last name isn't exactly necessary. And Adiris was so long ago, and as her role as High Priestess, she probably didn't need one either. But for people in the modern day, you'd think they would. What makes this even more strange is that Frank has a last name, Morrison, and Julie has a last name, Kostenko. In the Legion's lore, even Frank's relatively unimportant foster father is mentioned by his full name, Clive Andrews. So why not mention the last names of Susie and Joey? Possibly because they are what Frank and Julie consider sheep, a nameless face in a crowd. Or because they aren't real. What's further interesting is that the Legion only has two voices. Susie and Joey don't have their own voices, but take their voices from Frank and Julie. Now, sure, this could be because Behavior didn't want to record more voice lines, but could this be intentional? Looking into the Legion's add-ons, we can find 4 mixtapes. Each mixtape somewhat characterizes the 4 characters or members of the Legion. We have Susie's mixtape, described as a fast and thrilling mixtape with energizing songs and breakneck beats. Joey's described as a mix of banging tracks and slamming beats for chillaxing when life's a female dog. So these two are quite clearly upbeat and quite happy mixes of music that focus on being energizing and chillaxing when life isn't going your way. A much more normal approach to things going not so well. Compare this to Frank's, described as a track list of massive distortions and loud percussion that stabs at your eardrums. Something that sounds very reminiscent of the lobby music you hear when switching to them. Then Julie's, which reads, a dark and depressing mixtape made out from mainly power ballads and gloomy melodies. Like Frank, Julie sounds kind of depressing and much more stabby. These two mixtapes also reflect their worldview and perception of others and normality. In the Fuming mixtape Iridescent add-on that seemingly combines the 4 mixtapes of the Legion, we can read dark beats, violent shreds, and unfathomable vocals from another world fill the mind with a vibrating sixth sense. This to me doesn't sound like Susie or Joey's were taken into account, but only the more violent mixtapes of Frank and Julie. Another quick thing to note on is the visual divide of Legion members. Frank and Julie wear almost identical masks and leather jackets, yet Susie wears her school clothes and Joey wears more casual clothes and a mask that is entirely different. Throughout their base lore, the Legion's actions as a group are entirely dictated by Frank or Julie. Joey or Susie never make a definitive action that realistically changes the path they go on. The other curious thing is the characters of Joey and Susie as a whole. These two are misled, misguided people, but it's quite obvious they aren't evil. When Frank stabs the janitor in their Tome cutscene, they look at him like, dude, what? As you would if your friend just stabbed someone. These are not people who should be placed alongside the likes of the Nemesis. Next, I want to talk about the Tome cutscene that we received for the Legion a bit further. This cutscene depicts the night of the Legion's one and only murder that they do to a cleaner at Joey's old workplace after he has been fired, leading Frank to suggest they vandalized the store. This is initially interesting as it's quite clear upon arrival that the Legion aren't there to vandalize the store, but instead steal from it, attempting to crack open the register when they are found. Another interesting thing about this cutscene is that the cleaner has quite the familiar face. You probably remember him most likely from the Ghostface trailer, where he is also killed. What I'm getting at is that this is not the true memory or set of events that actually happened, that we read about in the base lore, but instead the skewed perception of likely how either Frank or more likely Julie, as it's her Tome lore, remembers it, because it makes no sense for this guy to be there. You'll also notice in the Tome cutscene that what is stated in the Legion's base lore is not true. After Frank stabs the man, Julie kills him by thrusting the blade up into his head. This means that Susie nor Joey never even injured him, but were just bystanders. In fact, they never even touched the knife, nor do they ever interact directly with Frank or Julie. Further, mysteriously, at the very end of the cutscene, they stand next to them, standing over the cleaner's body, seemingly now unfazed by the murder they just witnessed, where before they were shocked. So, what? Reading through the base lore description of the event, we get a drastically different situation. Reading, Joey clenched his jaw, grabbed the knife and stabbed the bleeding man in the ribs. Susie didn't want to do it. Frank shouted at her. They had to finish what they'd started. Julie closed her eyes and slid the knife into the man's chest. She handed the wet blade to Susie. They were all in this together now. Susie stared at Julie in disbelief as Frank grabbed her trembling hands and inserted the knife deep into the man's throat. Frank told them to move fast. They mopped the blood off the floor, stashed the body in the trunk of Joey's car, and drove up Mount Ormond. I think you probably understand what I'm getting at by now. Frank and Julie are clearly unreliable narrators, but also likely mentally ill to some degree. More so in the area of seeing things and potentially fabricating people entirely. When Frank and Julie look into the mirror, I think they see a different version of themselves there alongside their own face. So, are Joey and Susie real? I don't think so. At least, not yet. In fact, what I do think is that Joey and Susie represent what Frank and Julie could have been, or deep down want to be. Normal or accepted. Susie and Joey are the good flip side of what is inevitably their bad side, manifested as people by the entity. The entity saw the goodness and normality in them and was like, oh hey, wait up a sec, we can't be having anything like that around here. So it plucked it out of each of them, made them into separate people, and tortured and corrupted them until they were just as bad as Frank and Julie. Then it introduced them, which is likely what made Frank and Julie kinda down to stay where they were. Because after all this time, they finally fit in with the people they always wish they could be. Now, just like them. The people they couldn't be before due to their isolation or trauma. The new normal was in line with their worldview. The 9-to-5 worker, the good student, both were there and taking orders. And so the two voices deep down in the backs of Frank and Julie's heads were finally real, and more under their control. In their new image, Joey is confident, standing firm and remaining unfazed by his surroundings. Susie is grinning sadistically, enjoying her time also, and this is how they'll always be remembered. And together they are the Legion, a group of merciless killers who stand side by side, united, and one. Alright, I think that's gonna do it. I do hope you enjoyed. Thanks, and goodbye.